Before the past year, I had never considered myself a writer, nor imagined the directions my life is now taking me. Writing the introductions of my past work has my mind venturing into the complexities and liminality of my existence. At least, more than I had before starting this new calling in my spirit. I've always been particularly fond of written language since my childhood. I took to reading at a relatively young age. I remember in preschool I would assist the teachers during story time in reading the books to the rest of my class. In 6th grade, my school required us to do AR reading tests on the computer to see where we fell on a reading ability scale. The measurement scale was broken down into grade level categories based on empirically understood medians for each grade. I was 10 years old and tested into the college level reading category. My reading comprehension was equivalent to that of exiting seniors in high school. While this may have been a feat warranting celebration, I found it frustrating due to the limited capacity of my elementary school's library. I got stuck reading classics such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula. In the exciting flurry of transition to middle school for 7th grade, all of us coming from elementary schools were required to retake the AR computer examination. I wanted to read more interesting stories, and so as a form of dissent, I purposely responded wrong to a handful of questions. I tested into the 7th, 8th grade reading level category at that time. Before moving to California when I was 8, I grew up in a middle-class suburb north of San Antonio for a few years. While these years were colossally traumatizing for me, I hold in tandem whimsical memories of exploring the forest behind the home my parents rented. I remember studying the creek in the woods with a boy who lived across the street from us. He and I would spend hours following the stream up, stepping over smooth rocks worn away by the friction of the water. We would make up stories about how ghosts of former Puritan settlers were lurking in the distance. Some large, half-buried rocks enshrouded in moss, we would boldly declare their tombstones. I can recollect when I found an abandoned rusted-over Red Ryder tricycle, an astounding 5 feet off the ground, whilst adventuring through the woods. A kid, much like myself, had chained it to the tree, most likely many years before I was born, the former sapling now a large oak tree that had swallowed half of the tricycle. It was here, in space and time, that I believe instilled spiritual respect in me for history and all it has to offer. Another treasure within my memories of these woods was the skeletal remains of a car lost by time, the rubber of the tires, the once slick paint job, and the interior seats all but weathered away. To this day, I still wonder about the story surrounding that car and how it ever came to be abandoned in the woods. When I first stumbled upon the mechanical remains, I had fully expected to find the skeleton of some forgotten human victim inside. I often find myself pondering on the intricacies of the word victim lately, the historical and psychological complexities webbed between the letters. Merriam-Webster defines the word victim as one that is acted on and usually adversely affected by a force or agent. A part of what drags my attention to the word victim is how wide the spectrum of severity warrants the word's usage in the English language. It can start as anticlimactic as they are a fashion victim, and towards a far side of severity, the Palestinian people are victim to the genocide of Israel. When we dive into the word's etymology, we can find its roots in the 15th century, a word of Latin origin, typical within the English language. The Latin word victima stands parental to the word victim was just that the Latin word victima that stands parental to the word victim was strictly reserved to mean sacrificial animal, person, or animal killed as a sacrifice. I wonder how, over the centuries, the word began its transformation to utility over trivial matters. Throughout my life, I can say that I've often felt dismayed about this wide gap in the usage of the word victim. I worry about the consequences on our abstract understanding of the word. Words and our knowledge of them in the abstract hold power to influence our neural networks and sculpt both our exogenous and endogenous relationships. At umpteen moments in my life, I've been a victim of forces that have brought me great pain and suffering by the definition of the word. As a powerless and trusting child, I was victim to the demons haunting my parents and their impotence in suitably providing their children care and love. It would be too easy to purport the idea that my parents simply didn't try hard enough or that they should never have had kids. It's an emotionally seductive conclusion, a compact and easily understood raft to carry me through tumultuous waters. I have found more recently through my Buddhist faith that all things arise from causes and conditions dependent on one another. In a sinking ship, the raft which we cling to for survival did not operate as a show of Delphic forces. It had been constructed by one or many people and preemptively placed aboard the vessel. My parents, grappling with their respective unendurable childhoods, the relentless anguish they had experienced far before the universe ever declaimed my arrival, are the causes and conditions that gave rise to their ineptitude as caregivers. I look back at my childhood now and only see repeating patterns of pain and suffering described in the teachings of cyclic existence, of dukkha. Recognizing and cognizing each interdependent causation, the multitudinous and tangled threads of fate, the exertion can often be inundating. Too easy it could have been to proclaim my parents failed in their responsibility to me when the dire reality is they too were victims of their upbringings. Often, as I lie my head snugly atop my pillow, in a liminal moment of hushed ego, I can hear the despaired and brutalized shadows of who my parents used to be. Children who needed tender and responsive love, bellowing the utmost guttural pleas for salvation, just as I did many years later. How different our conjoined histories and fates may have betided, had my parents tasted unassailable security and genuine intimacy, in lieu of the decadent nourishment of physical and psychological torture. This developing Buddha nature that encompasses me, I believe, is what bores an exigent maturescence within me. My maturescence, in turn, forges an endogenous relationship to the children my parents were once long ago. I believe there is a lot we can learn from history besides the recalling of events. The history we learn in school, the history we absorb from our families, never ceases to exist, but impregnates our spirits at all times. Some may refer to this spiritual breathing as demons haunting the future, but for me, it's a requisite to my cellular functioning as essentially as the oxygen I breathe. One of my favorite words is the aforementioned maturescence, the action or fact of reaching maturity. I observe encompassing United States culture a phenomenon of disenfranchised millennials and Gen Z feeling dismayed about the milestones of maturity in their life being unachievable. Such milestones of maturity like buying a home or starting a family, the reasoning most often extended is that of financial constraints or the inability to find a suitable partner in the modern world. I find it painstakingly daunting how capitalism in the US from the time of the Industrial Revolution, and especially the fabrication of the nuclear family in the era following World War II, has replaced past historical milestones of maturity. We have copious amounts of adults of all generations today that are psychologically infantile, with many providing the low-hanging fruit of lack of capitalistic milestones of maturity as the reasoning. How can we mature if capitalism doesn't provide us the convenience of showing the way? I can exhaustively recall the day I started my journey of maturity from boyhood to manhood, despite the many setbacks I had encountered, pushing me back into psychological infantilism in the time that followed. I was freshly 17, and I had made what at that time seemed like the incredulously challenging decision to leave my mother's sphere of influence. Many who stumble upon this video essay may understand the unstable and treacherous waters that are codependency with a caregiver, how psychologically damaging emotional incest can be. My mother and I had developed a distasteful relationship through our mutual suffering and survival in domestic violence through my childhood. I was the eldest child, so I was blighted with the responsibility of caring for my horrifically traumatized mother, as well as my younger siblings. At this time, when I was 16, we had lost our home through eviction. Simply put, my mother, I, and my two younger siblings had found ourselves homeless. For months, I pleaded with my mother to go to a women and children's shelter with my two younger siblings in tow, that I can go to the youth shelter on my own since I was over the age of 12. Months had passed, and we all had been staying in a motel together, a voucher from social services providing a stay for only 1 month. It was our last night available, and we had to be out by 11 a.m. the next morning. My mother was notorious for sleeping until noon. It wasn't until this past year it was discovered she had celiac disease, and I as well, and for handling important matters at the last second. So I nagged her about the idea that we should pack all our belongings right then before bed, so as not to stress in the morning nor accidentally leave belongings behind. I perhaps struck a nerve in my anxious nagging for some parental responsibility in the situation, as my mother responded as if I had been bullying her, screaming for me to allow her disengagement from my barrage of personal attacks. She and my siblings proceeded to drift off to sleep, most likely in preparation for the stress to follow the next day. I, however, could not sleep knowing the disaster that waited mere hours after sunbreak. I decided to pack up my things, grumbling in frustration as I silently worked to gather my belongings into my duffel bag, my brain ruminating on this insufferable cycle of behavior I had endured my entire upbringing. How wonderful a gift the nativity of childhood can be before we feel the spiritual heaviness of all the histories that came before us, the history known in transparency and the history shrouded in emptiness, twain sides of a psycho-spiritual coin. It was now near 3 a.m., and I had finished gathering my belongings, triple-checking I hadn't forgotten or misplaced a single item I considered of importance, to further attempt to soothe my anxiety that was now edging towards panic through my rumination. I could foresee the responsibility of packing and corralling my youngest siblings befalling me in the late morning. I remember grumbling to myself, why is it my responsibility to care for her and my siblings? Why is it my responsibility to always solve things for her? I was rightfully upset at it was not her who packed up the entire house when it was time to leave 6 months prior. It was 2 of my friends and me at the time who moved every belonging and piece of furniture into the moving van. At one point, this group of teenagers needing her advice on how to pack something, only to have our calling out her name to be ignored, later finding her under a bed, hiding under her bed, playing a game on her phone, laughing that we had found her, reminiscent of a small child playing a game. It was right then, in the twilight of the morning, that I realized it was not my duty to handle all of this, that if I didn't have a parent in practice already, then maybe I could raise myself better without the false constraints, as I already had been in my internal narration. I could no longer ignore the calling of my intuition. When dawn broke on the horizon and streams of light began to venture between the curtains of the disheveled and overcrowded motel room, I bail-lifted my duffel, virtually as big as I, and left. I walked this way a mile to the nearest light rail station, took the westbound train to the downtown area, and began my life as an independent young man. A spiritual awakening depending on the focal point. There are many stories, traumas, and misadventures that occurred after that fateful day, but I have not once regretted my decision. My mother later in the afternoon called the homeless youth drop-in center I had taken to spending my days at, pleading at first for me to come back to help her. I remained steadfast in my decision and rejected her pleas, only to be met with insults and the use of the English language as a weapon. This had only reaffirmed to me the need for her and me to separate. This is the moment I can identify as the first step towards my maturescence. I treasure it dearly as the start of the fool's journey mirrored in my tome. With this experience in mind, I have observed myself bitterly struggling to relate to people's cries about the lack of maturity they experience. Capitalism is an evil to be stricken from this world under no doubt, but I find it hard to believe that it is the sole reason for people's psychological infantilism. This is a mere projection of my still unattended histories, I'm certain, however. It is to no one person's fault today in the United States that there exists a spiritual vacuum. I believe in earnest that the spiritual vacuum, set in motion many centuries before, is the real culprit to the lack of maturescence in the stream of the planet we share.